the better job you can do with capturing that information in their own words, the more likely it is that your website content and your emails and your social and your educational resources and your educational events, both in person and virtual, the more likely it is that those really provide a lot of value and those really resonate. Skip that step, and the more likely you're going to find the opposite, is that you're going to completely, like, no one's going to pay attention to you because you're not talking in terms that they actually care about. So that's an essential part of the go-to-market as well, is that customer insight from knowing exactly who these buyer personas are, the words they use to articulate their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, and how you're going to show up with great educational resources, great educational events that help those buyer personas achieve their goals and overcome the frustrations that they're dealing with when it comes to their biggest challenges. And in the self-driven buyer's journey that we now live in, where most people are spending a ton of time before they're open to spending a ton of time doing self-directed research before they're open to spending time with members of your sales team, it is incredibly important that we show up early and often. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscale, edge, modular, colocation, and wholesale data centers, as well as the technology and the facilities companies that sell to and partner with data center operators and enterprise data centers. And who could forget the construction and real estate and investment companies that are an essential part of digital infrastructure, data centers, and critical facilities. And then there are the outsourced sales and marketing companies that sell to or partner with the data center ecosystem. And there's a lot of different people on a typical go-to-market team to make all of this happen. There's folks in sales, marketing, account management, product managers, channel partner managers, and in nearly all cases, someone from the executive suite, an executive sponsor that's responsible for bringing all of this together, getting everyone on the same page, being the master of alignment, like the orchestra conductor of a symphony, trying to get everyone to play their exact parts at the right time, at the right tempo, at the right volume, to have a masterful impact on data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If this is the first time that you're tuning into our weekly Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to make sure that you are reminded about upcoming shows just like this. Another great way to stay in the loop on what we have brewing over at DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, is to make sure that you subscribe to our weekly email newsletter that you can find directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com, where you'll be able to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. So what is on the agenda for this week? What are the 6 questions that we'll be looking at? We're first going to start by diving into how to reach the right data center infrastructure managers for rack and cable management, how to reach the right data center infrastructure managers for rack and cable management. Then we'll turn our attention to how to create a go-to-market, a GTM strategy for data center colocation, connectivity, and build-to-suit solutions. After that, we'll look at how to create awareness of high-capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity. Then we'll take a quick break for a word or two from our sponsor. After that, when we come back with the second half of this week's Q&A show, we'll get into how a data center managed service provider, MSP, can run good Google Ads campaigns. That's really tactical. Then we'll dive into how to penetrate the data center real estate, DCRE, and construction executive search market. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream, we'll look at how to improve reach for automated software that manages data center performance. If you have an idea for a question or a topic or a challenge that you and your team are currently struggling with that you'd like us to add to the queue to address on an upcoming show, make sure to drop that into the comments on whatever platform you like to watch this on. So let's jump into this week's first question. How do we reach the right data center infrastructure managers for rack and cable management? So your company provides rack and cable management solutions, and you're wondering how you can reach the proper data center infrastructure managers. That's a great question. And the first part of it you'll need to define is, where are these infrastructure managers located? Can you sell rack and cable management solutions globally? Or do you primarily sell in one region of the world or in one country or group of countries? So, in terms of attracting the right infrastructure managers, let's first determine and document on paper or digitally who these infrastructure managers are. Let's make sure that we get your ideal client profile, your ICP, nailed down. So let's start geographically. Where can you successfully market, sell, and service, either through your direct sales force and service capabilities or through channel partners? Second, are you successful in selling to infrastructure managers regardless of their company size? Or is there a case where the company is so small that they can't afford your minimums, or could be so large that it would be very far-fetched that they would buy from you because they may either choose to build their own or want them white labeled or want some kind of financing or long sales cycle or jumping through hoops that your company just may not be able to do? So in addition to getting really clear about where these infrastructure managers are located, I want you to think about the company size where you tend to do best. How do you know where you do best? Look at your website first, see if there's any clues on there when you look at your existing case studies, when you look at your testimonials, your reviews, your logos. If you don't have any clues sitting there, the next place to be would be to go into your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and see where your best clients have been located historically, both geographically and their company size. And I know it's really tempting with company size, especially when you're talking about rack and cable management, to look at square footage, square meters, or power density. But if you're going to do any kind of prospecting, any kind of outbound, any kind of ads, anything regarding lead generation, sales cycle acceleration, marketing, sales, go to market, at some point you will almost certainly need to normalize that targeting criteria by a number of employees. So think long and hard about what size company is just too small that they just wouldn't be able to afford what you offer, and what is so large that it's really, really far-fetched that your company could profitably deliver those rack and cable management solutions given your company's current capabilities. So we've talked about the geography part. We've talked about the geographical part of where these infrastructure managers are located. And we talked about how big or how small or how medium size, like Goldilocks, right? Not too big, not too hot, not too cold, not too big, not too small. We've talked about what range of company sizes these infrastructure managers tend to work at. And then think about, are there certain business models? Are there certain verticals? Are there certain industries where you do better than others based on your existing track record? Because you tend to be exceptionally well at marketing and selling to certain segments. You tend to do exceptionally well at servicing certain segments. There's a lot of reason why that can happen. Usually when it comes to rack and cable management, you don't bump into the same kind of compliance or certification stuff that may be as big of an issue with like an operator, but there may be some things there as well that could be where you get knocked out based on not having certain certifications or compliance type of requirements that they're looking for that not everybody would have for your particular business model. So again, get clear on geographically where they're located, get clear on how big or how small they are, and if there's certain industries where you tend to do better than others. That defines the company. Once you have the company tightly locked down, the ideal client profile, then think about who the key people are in this particular account. It's pretty clear that you want to sell to infrastructure managers, so that for sure we're going to call your primary buyer persona. But it's not enough to just declare that it's infrastructure managers. We really need to know what's going on in their world. When we talk to 5, 10, 15, 20 data center infrastructure managers, either face to face or on video conferences or by phone. Or if we can't get access to 15, 20 people that are infrastructure managers that fit your ideal client profile, the next thing may be to look up 10, 15, 20 people that have that particular job title in your region at those company sizes and get a stack of LinkedIn profiles to look at and take the same names and job titles and company names of those people and see what shows up on a simple Google search. And I want you to get the consensus about their biggest goals that they need to achieve professionally and that their team is currently working on and that their company is currently working on, from anchoring to infrastructure management, specifically at the intersection of goals that are related to rack and cable management. That's what they're trying. That's what they're getting bonused on. That's what they're getting evaluated on. They may have objectives and key results, OKRs, that are tied to that. For sure would show up in job descriptions. Then I want you to think of the flip side. That's what they're trying to achieve. Now, what are they struggling with? What's driving them nuts? What are their biggest challenges? And I want you to also find the consensus from those same 10, 15, 20 people about what they're struggling with the most. And the reason that you need to look at anywhere from 5 to 20 people and not just pull this out of thin air by talking with Bob or Sally, who've been at your company a long time and think they have all the answers. The problem is Bob and Sally may not be able to describe the subtle nuances that your buyer personas can in their own words. And getting these goals articulated in their own words, getting these challenges articulated in their own words is incredibly important for being able to cut through the noise in very crowded spaces and stand out and differentiate and get someone like this infrastructure manager that you're trying to target to actually pay attention to you in the first place. Once you have done this research and you figured out the consensus for the biggest goals and challenges of the infrastructure manager, then you can use that information to come up with your content strategy and your educational event strategy. Before you get into publishing content to support the infrastructure manager throughout their full buyer's journey, we need to know what's going on in their world. That's why it's so incredibly important to do this research. And not only do we need to have this information when we create these educational resources, it's also the same information that we need to make sure that we nail it with relevancy when we create educational events. It's more important than ever to invest aggressively in creating these resources and events because we now live in a world where the self-driven, self-guided buyer's journey has become the predominant buyer's journey. What does that mean? The latest research from Gartner found that 83% of a typical buyer's journey is now over before sales contact, before vendor contact. That means that the data center infrastructure managers that you're trying to target and bring into your world, they don't want to talk with anyone from your company, especially in a sales context, until they've done 83% of making up their mind. That is a huge difference from as recently as 10 years ago when that number used to hover around half. During most of the 2010s, 56% was the number that most people referenced from Corporate Executive Board, the CEB, that's now part of Gartner. They originally did research with Sirius Decisions and Salesforce on this, and they found at the time 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact. That difference between 56% 10 years ago and 83% today is a lot of you being left out in the cold. And the only way that you're going to earn your way back in to have a meaningful role in the education and trust building where you can have a massive difference in shaping the criteria that these infrastructure managers use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them for rack and cable management is getting in there early and getting in there often, not as a vendor who's trying to pitch them something, but as a consultant, as a teacher, as a trusted advisor, as a subject matter expert, and perhaps even as a thought leader. So the question is, who on your team internally can successfully today pull off showing up in front of data center infrastructure managers as a teacher, as a consultant, as a subject matter expert on rack and cable management solutions? If you don't have anyone internally, that's a whole separate problem, and you may look to external subject matter experts, consultants that you would hire under the umbrella of your company, or channel partners, or someone else that you work with. But if you want to have a role in shaping how these infrastructure managers navigate their buyer's journey and shaping the criteria that they're ultimately going to use to judge everyone else in this category, your company needs to have a role in as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision as possible. Most companies that sell rack and cable management are likely spending some serious bucks, some serious resources and budget going to big national and global conferences. And those are all well and good, but just understand that that conference is only one touch point. It doesn't matter how amazing the cabana party was that you sponsored at that conference, or how epic the golf tournament was. It's just one or two touch points. In other words, that person, no matter how enamored they were with having a blast hanging out with your team, they're still going to go through 24, 25, 26 more touch points before they buy. So the question is, are you going to show up, or is someone that you compete with going to show up? Ultimately, the choice is yours, but make no mistake, they're learning from someone. And the one that they're learning from and that they're spending the most time with is going to have a profound impact on educating and building trust. Do you want that company to be you? Do you want it to be members of your team, or do you want them to look elsewhere? Ultimately, the choice is yours. So we need to get hyper specific about the companies where these infrastructure managers work, where they're located, the company size, potential industries. We need to get hyper specific about what's going on in their world, their professional goals, their professional struggles. And we need to figure out a way to show up early and often as possible, to crowd out, to motivate the infrastructure manager to want to spend time with members of our sales team, and essentially by extension, crowding out the need for them to spend time with anyone else. And it is a complete game changer when these infrastructure managers want to spend time with members of your team, as opposed to you having to chase and beg and nag them to take your meetings. So this is a mindset issue, and it's a cultural issue for a lot of companies. And especially in this category, there is an astonishing amount of companies that think that their buyers still live in 10 years ago, that their buyers have never discovered LinkedIn or YouTube or webinars or review websites or ChatGPT or Google or Perplexity or Gemini. They live in this bubble where they think that, I don't know if you've ever heard the idea that like there's 10,000 baby boomers a day retiring. And we know over time that millennials and Gen Z are moving into more decision-making roles. And is it really realistic that when a 75-year-old CEO retires, that they're going to be replaced by another 75-year CEO that's digitally resistant with any of this? By the way, I'm Gen X, and all of the people that I know that are baby boomers that are still working on a part-time or full-time basis in data centers, every single one of them attends webinars and watches podcasts and is active on LinkedIn. So when your playbook is trying to reach someone who you think doesn't use any of those, who the heck are you targeting? We've already reached the tipping point on this. This isn't a future prediction of what's going to happen. This is what's already happened. And it accelerated dramatically in the early 2020s when millions of people were working from home for a few years. So at the end of the day, if your company is really serious about reaching the right data center infrastructure managers for rack and cable management, get really close to understanding who they are and what they care about, and make sure that you're showing up in the way that they want you to show up. Not how you want to show up, but how they actually want you to show up. If you want to get a foot in the door early and often, if you want to get invited in onto their side of the table, I can assure you that it's no longer about showing up as a vendor. It's about showing up as an educator, as a subject matter expert, as a trusted advisor, as a consultant. Next question up for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is, how do we create a go-to-market, a GTM, for data center colocation, connectivity, and build-to-suit solutions? So your company's in the business of colocation, connectivity, and build-to-suit, and you're wondering what you can do to create a go-to-market. Well, you're for sure in the right place. So the first question that you need to ask yourself is it the exact same kind of client that is buying all three from you? In other words, are you selling colo, are you selling connectivity and build to suit to a largely homogeneous client, the exact same ideal client profile? They're in the same location, they have roughly the same number of employees, they're in the same kind of industries, or are these potentially 2 or 3 different kinds of clients? If it's potentially 2 or 3 different kinds of clients who would buy colocation, connectivity, and build to suit, you potentially need 2 or 3 different go-to-market strategies. If you try to come up with one size fits most, it's not going to resonate with anyone. So knowing these business models, it's entirely possible that you have potentially 3 different segments here. That the client who buys colocation may get connectivity elsewhere. You may also be bundling connectivity with colocation. The build to suit isn't build to suit kind of the opposite of colocation, right? To a certain degree, you're like talking about retail versus wholesale. Could they buy connectivity from you, or would they insist on bringing their own connectivity and get into a heated discussion about meet me rooms and carrier neutrality and peering and competition and everything like that? Again, these are going to really depend on your business model, your capital structure, what you're focused on, your competitive advantages in various aspects of retail versus wholesale, and building to suit versus colocation. But at the end of the day, it's very possible that you need 2, perhaps 3 different go-to-market strategies. For each of these, the first thing to do is get really clear about who the company is. Because when it comes to the difference between colocation and wholesale, or colocation and build to suit, your company size may be a completely different context. So let's first get clear about geographically who we're looking to reach. Even when it comes to colocation and build to suits, for many companies, because this is such a proximity-based business, you're likely going to need a part of your go-to-market that's focused on hyper-local activities. In other words, blanketing the right people that are within like a 30 or 60-minute drive of your facility or facilities. And then you likely need a different go-to-market for reaching a national or global audience that you want to attract who's not able to get to your facility within a 30 or 60-minute drive. For the hyper-local version of your go-to-market, name of the game most of the time is getting people to come out and visit and tour your facilities. The first cousin of that would be bundling in some educational experiences, some community events that make it more interesting than just someone coming in for a tour. Because for sure, there's always decision makers, there's always stakeholders who want to come in for a tour, but a much, much, much wider part of your funnel are people that work in the right companies, that are in the right kinds of job functions in these companies, that could be super interested in getting a tour from you a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe several months down the road. But in the meantime, they might be really motivated to come into an educational event or a networking event or a community event that you're hosting in your facility. In addition to that, there's also usually a lot of opportunities for working with other entities, other communities, other events that are hyperlocal to also reach your area. And I'm partial to you sending subject matter experts from your team to go speak at those events, so you can show up there in an educational context as opposed to an advertorial or advertising or sponsorship kind of context. But either way, just recognize that there's this hyper-local playbook that's especially relevant for colocation and build to suit. And then there's this potentially national or global playbook. And the national and global playbook, you're going to lean very heavily on digital experiences. You're more than likely going to attract those people or reach out to those people through some kind of digital experience, either outbound email or LinkedIn or YouTube or podcasting or webinars or something like that. You'll continue to nurture those folks through events like webinars and live streams, virtual tours, email marketing. Again, experiences that can be delivered long distance. more than likely the kind of team members that you're going to hire that are really good at hyperlocal may not necessarily be great at digital. And the people that are really good at digital may not necessarily be the perfect people for hyperlocal because proximity matters. So at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you just want a hyperlocal go to market for your colo and your build to suit, or whether you want to have both a hyperlocal and a long distance or a digital kind of go to market for each of those. So potentially we're already talking about uh, 4 different go to markets, for a different one for hyperlocal colocation and long distance colocation, potentially a hyperlocal build to suit go to market and a long distance build to suit, again, depending on proximity. So, with all of that in mind, document that ideal client profile, know geographically where they're located, know their company size, what's big enough that they can afford your minimums, but not so large that you might be outcompeted by much larger companies with much bigger resources than you currently have. And then think about, for both the build to suit side and especially on the co-location side, are there certain industries or verticals or business models where you tend to be a much better fit than others because of existing investments that you've already made in compliance and certifications and existing staff member competency around addressing those kinds of needs that may be especially relevant around like healthcare or financial services or government or education or something along those lines. So we've gotten our ideal client profile under control. Next, who are the personas, the individual people within these accounts that you want to build these relationships with? But before we even get so deep, first let's identify who those people are and prioritize for both a co-location account and a build to suit account. Who's the number one person we want to get a foot in the door with? Who's the second most important kind of person we want to get a foot in the door with? So we'll not only document who these buyer personas are, we'll rank them, we'll prioritize them. So we'll have a primary buyer persona and a secondary buyer persona for each of these. Once we have that in mind, and once we have your ideal client profile figured out, you should be able to build a target account list of specifically named companies. In the case of build to suit, it may be a much smaller list. Maybe it's a few dozen companies. In the case of co-location, it could be a much larger list. Maybe it's a couple hundred or a few thousand companies. That would be a perfect fit for your co-location and build to suit, and potentially for your connectivity solutions as well. So we have your ideal client profile written down. We have your account list, you're targeting for account-based selling, account-based marketing. That's built out as well. And we've identified, designated, and prioritized who these buyer personas are. Next, we need to get deeper into the minds of what's going on in the world of each of who these buyer personas are. And in some cases, it may be a IT executive. In some cases, it may be a finance executive. In some cases, it may be a development executive, someone more on the real estate side or the capital market side. Again, it really depends on how big or how small your company is and how big or how small your target audience is, where you win the best. But make no mistake, for these 2 or 3 separate needs, you're almost certainly going to need a separate go-to-market. There's probably a set of buyer personas that's a little bit different for each. And the better job you do at figuring out the consensus on each of those buyer personas' goals that they're working on professionally, both individually, as a team, and as a company, things that show up like in a job description, may even show up like in their objectives and key results or OKRs. The better job you can do with capturing that information in their own words, the more likely it is that your website content and your emails and your social and your educational resources and your educational events, both in person and virtual, the more likely it is that those really provide a lot of value and those really resonate. Skip that step, and the more likely you're going to find the opposite, is that you're going to completely, like, no one's going to pay attention to you because you're not talking in terms that they actually care about. So that's an essential part of the go-to-market as well, is that customer insight from knowing exactly who these buyer personas are, the words they use to articulate their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, and how you're going to show up with great educational resources, great educational events that help those buyer personas achieve their goals and overcome the frustrations that they're dealing with when it comes to their biggest challenges. And in the self-driven buyer's journey that we now live in, where most people are spending a ton of time before they're open to spending a ton of time doing self-directed research before they're open to spending time with members of your sales team, it is incredibly important that we show up early and often. And not just as a vendor who wants to sell them colocation or build to suit or connectivity. We need to now show up as teachers, as consultants, as subject matter experts, and trusted advisors that are providing this amazing educational experience for these specific people, what's top of mind for them. And the better job we can do with articulating that, the more likely it is that we're going to earn a role early and often. And it's incredibly important in the self-driven buyer's journey, where by default, most people don't want to talk to you anymore until they're 83% of the way through their process. The way we earn our way in is by showing up as consultants and teachers and trusted advisors and subject matter experts. So look among your existing team members and figure out who would be seen, who would have the street cred to be super interesting to your buyer personas on these topics when it comes to presenting as an expert, as a teacher, as a consultant, and perhaps even as a thought leader. That's an incredibly important part of doing this. And for a lot of companies, this is a big culture change that needs to start from the top down, like really, really the top down. If your company is a couple dozen or a few hundred employees, your executive sponsor of this should more than likely be the CEO. For a much larger company, your executive sponsor could be a chief commercial officer or a chief revenue officer. But these are really, really big changes that a lot of companies need to go through to figure out what the right go-to-market strategy is for colocation, connectivity, and build to suit, and leaning into the idea that you don't have anywhere near the surface area that you used to as recently as 10 years ago for your sales team to be invited in. The way we get invited in now is doing a radical makeover of how your sales team presents itself so that your sales team actually is able to provide a vibe and provide value that appears more like Big Four consultants and less like traditional vendor or salesperson trying to put a deal on the board and make their quota. Think about, and it's not as simple as going in and doing a find and replace on job titles, sitting in email signatures, LinkedIn profiles, and business cards, but that's certainly part of it. So at the end of the day, if you really understand what business you're truly in when it comes to your colocation, connectivity, and build to suit, and you're trying to come up with an effective go-to-market strategy, lean into the one that gives your client-facing team the ability to get invited in early and often and to have a massive impact on the criteria that your prospects and clients use to evaluate all the different options in front of them. And the way you do that is by dominating as many of those 28 touch points throughout the buyer's journey as possible, so that you have a deep relationship with your intended prospects and clients throughout their awareness and their consideration stages of their journey, and not just showing up at the tail end, not just showing up at the decision stage when they're ready for sales contact. Because by default, most companies that you're competing with that are asleep at the wheel on this are literally completely absent in the first 83% of the buyer's journey. You have an opportunity, now that you know this, to turn the tables and stack the decks tremendously in your company's favor. But it starts with recognizing that buyer preferences has changed. And then it continues when you take massive action to show up early and often as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with colo, connectivity, and build to suit for your most important buyer personas. Next question up is, how do we create awareness of high capacity fiber infrastructure and optical networking and connectivity? So your company is principally in the business of selling high capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity, and you're struggling with creating awareness. So we need to know, for starters, are these three separate lines of business typically marketed to the exact same kind of stakeholder and the exact same kind of company? Or have you historically found that your buyers of high capacity fiber infrastructure and optical networking and connectivity are typically from different kinds of companies and different kinds of stakeholders in those companies? Only you can answer that. Usually as a starting point, you'll dig into your case studies and your logos and your testimonials and your reviews. You'll probably also spend some time in your customer relationship, your CRM system, to see where you've done best, who's gotten the best initial intended and extended value, who's become a great goodwill ambassador, who's given you great positive word of mouth reviews, who showed up whenever you've asked them to participate in educational events and panels and things along those lines, and been a great reference account. But at the end of the day, is it three different kinds of companies, potentially three different kinds of stakeholders that buy and get great value from your high capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity, or is it one? If it's one, you've made your job tremendously easier because you only need to create awareness with one kind of company and one or more different stakeholders within those companies. For the sake of this example, let's make this super simple. And you've found that through having amazing insights and really understanding what's going on in your clients and having this great product line, that you've been able to sell all three of these: the infrastructure, the networking, the optical networking, and connectivity to the same kind of client. So with that client, let's get really specific about who we need to create awareness in front of. Who are the companies that define who we're looking to go after? Let's get really specific about where they're located. Can you truly sell globally? Or are you only selling in one region of the world or one country or a cluster of countries? Can you really sell your infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity to companies regardless of size? Or is there a certain minimum that a client needs to be to afford your minimums? And is there a certain maximum where an enterprise gets so huge that it may be overwhelming and not a great fit for your company's current capabilities to market, sell, and service to? So we're now to the point where hopefully you have a geographic identifier on where you want to create awareness, and we have a company size parameter spec on what's the minimum size they need to be and the maximum size they should be to be a good fit for you. And then they may likely be some industry or verticals or business model type of criteria that comes up as well on where you've done especially well or where you've had a really hard time making inroads because of that particular industry and because of their unique needs. So once we have the company in mind, you should be able to build a target account list of the companies who could be a great fit based on where they're located, their size, and their business model. And depending on your geographic coverage, depending on how expansive your product line is, it could be a couple dozen, it could be a few hundred, it could be a few thousand companies. And then we need to know within those companies who would care the most about your fiber infrastructure, your optical networking, and your connectivity. Is it a telecommunications manager? Is it an infrastructure manager? Is it a small enough company that this gets all the way up to the level of an IT executive? Again, only you can answer that kind of question. It depends on how big or small these companies are, the nature of what you do, but you do need to understand who your most important stakeholder is that you want to build awareness with. If you're a brand new company, a lot of your early experiments around getting to product market fit will revolve around trying to figure out who this perfect person is. If you've been in business for a while, you likely know the person that is almost always going to be involved in a successful account. And you, over time, probably likely also know the kind of person who's the second most important person to be involved in this kind of account. Maybe the infrastructure manager is a primary person and a telecommunications professional is the secondary person. Maybe telecommunications is the primary and a network engineering person is the secondary. Again, this is going to vary tremendously depending on the nature of your business model. For some companies in this category, it's like telecommunications related. You may find a channel partner is a really important part of these overall accounts, like a integrator or a consulting firm or a managed service provider or something like that. But either way, once you know who you're prioritizing as the most important, we need to get into their world. We need to understand what their biggest goals are, what their biggest challenges are in their own words, not what we think the words are, but what their words actually are, because that's how we're going to make sure that our website copywriting and our product marketing and our sales enablement, outbound and our educational resources and our events, that's how we're going to make sure that it resonates with them. Because we're not going to guess. We're going to do the homework. We're going to do the research, and we're going to figure out exactly what those words are that describe how they articulate their biggest professional goals at the intersection of high capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity. We're also, on the flip side, in addition to understanding their goals, we need to understand what their biggest frustrations are in their own words, what's driving them nuts, what's stressing them out, what's ruining their vacations and their work-life balance. Once we know the consensus on their biggest goals and challenges for each of those buyer personas, then we're in a great position to create a content calendar and an educational events calendar of how we're going to show up in their world, how we're going to earn their way in early and often to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with high-capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity. And this isn't just a differentiator. This is what's going to keep us relevant in the coming weeks, in the coming months, and in the coming years, because we're not forecasting what's going to happen. This is what is already happened. We now live in a world where it used to be that your sales team could count on spending about half of the journey with your prospects and clients. Those days are gone. Now you're lucky if you get to spend 15 or 20% of the journey with your prospects and clients. Gartner says like 83% of a typical journey is over before vendor contact or sales contact. So best case scenario, your team's only going to be in there 17% of the time, or the last 17% of the decision-making process, when all of the criteria has already been established. If you want to be in a position to shape that criteria that your most important prospects and clients use to evaluate everyone else that's in front of them for high capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity, it is incredibly important that we get out of the vendor box and we instead show up as experts, as consultants, as trusted advisors, as teachers, and perhaps even thought leaders. And the way we do that is, in most cases, it involves a radical makeover of how you position your client-facing team, your client-facing go-to-market team, across marketing, sales, account managers, product managers, channel managers, even your executive team. Because in order for us to have these deep relationships, we're in on as many of these 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision. We can't show up the way we've just been showing up the last couple of years, because they don't want to spend time with us anymore when we're just showing up as a vendor. We need to show up as true experts. So we are top of mind, at the top of the short list, and we stay on the short list throughout the full buyer's journey. And when we do an exceptionally good job with these educational resources and these educational events, we will, by default, we will end up knocking competitors off of the short list, out of contention, because they're falling in love with our resources and our educational events. And by extension, they're falling in love with our brand and our company. And we're creating incredibly loyal prospects and clients. So by the time they're ready to purchase, in many cases, the shortlist has collapsed down to literally your company and your company only, which is fantastic, because that gets rid of having to compete on price and the things that destroy your profit margins and your morale and could threaten the very survival of your company. So at the end of the day, if you're serious about creating awareness of your company's high capacity fiber infrastructure, optical networking, and connectivity, we need to know the companies and the individuals within the companies that are most relevant. And we need to show up in a way that exudes enormous amount of value, so that those most important stakeholders, those most important buyer personas, see you and your team as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with a company in their location, at their company size, in that kind of industry, at the intersection of optical networking, high-capacity fiber infrastructure, and connectivity. With that, we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor, and then we're going to come back with 3 more great questions on data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com. Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you're watching our weekly live Q&A show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges from all over the data center ecosystem. If you're getting great value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a question that we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to drop that into the comments on whatever platform you enjoy watching on. So the next question up for this week's show is, how does a data center managed service provider, MSP, run good Google Ads campaigns? How does a data center managed service provider, data center MSP, run good Google Ads campaigns? And that's a fantastic question, both to be asking and one that I love answering for a couple of reasons. One is, in case we have never met, you may not realize that I actually came into working with data centers, the digital infrastructure industry, in the early 2010s because of managed service providers. Throughout most of the early stages of my career, in addition to owning a evaluated reseller business, a computer reseller business, and doing SMB IT consulting for the better part of 10 or 15 years, first starting with working with Microsoft's small business server product team in Redmond, Washington, and the Microsoft Direct Access Channel Partner Program in Redmond, Washington. I had gotten to work with a couple thousand SMB, VARs, and evaluated resellers and managed service providers and IT consultancies all over the planet, most heavily concentrated in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. But I really, really got a deep appreciation of the business model for fractional CTOs, for fractional chief technology officers that work with small businesses. And what's super interesting to me is that in the late 2000s, early 2010s, I started to see a lot of the owners of these companies struggling to reinvent themselves as the world moved from client server to cloud and SaaS, premise-based to cloud and SaaS. But the ones that were figuring this out, one is there were some generational issues where in a lot of cases, the founder was 25, 30 years into the business, nearing retirement. They had started their business in the early heyday of client server back Novell NetWare and really, really early generation Windows. And we're now nearing the place where they were looking at a succession plan. But the ones that were figuring out what their next act was going to be successfully in the early 2010s were going in one of three directions. Some of them were moving up market into mid-market ERP, enterprise resource planning, or similar kinds of specialization. Some of them decided to become custom software developers building web apps and mobile apps. And a third category that resonated most with me is they got into colocation. How did they get into colocation? They would take one of their servers and they would put it in a colo facility and they would rent out slices of that server to their existing outsourced IT clients as an add-on to their existing fractional CTO, fractional CIO kind of services that they were already providing as a managed service provider. In a few cases, they had really forward-thinking clients who would come back from an industry conference, like they were at a hospitality conference or a manufacturing conference, and they would come back and they would say to their fractional CTO, "We don't know what this means, but we attended a session at a conference and we need to co-locate a server. We have no idea what that means. You do. You're outsourced our fractional CTO. You go figure it out. Tell us what it's going to cost, and we'll sign up." So this was my early brush in the early 2010s into understanding what colocation was all about. And the reason it resonated is for the better part of 12, 15 years before that, I had been involved in supporting companies that were developing websites and intranets and extranets, as they were called at the time. So I really understood like what web hosting was all about. And I was starting to understand a little bit what cloud hosting was all about. So yeah, this was the early stages of infrastructure as a service. And for the first couple of years, I understood that part of the technology ecosystem in data centers, like I understood cybersecurity and networking and cabling and connectivity and software, but really didn't have a strong handle on the facility side for a while, or certainly not the construction or real estate or all the different kind of operators. Fortunately, within a couple of years, I figured all that out and now consider myself a reasonably adept tour guide and concierge of all of the different segments and silos and subsegments within the data center industry. So that's why this really, really resonated with me, because so many people are struggling with this business model issue. A lot of data center operators want to provide what they sometimes call amenities, where they provide these add-on services, managed services. The challenge is, though, is many times they also have channel partners who are managed service providers. So how do you figure out, like borrowing from the telecommunications world, what is the demarcation point between what is the colocation operator going to sell to clients in terms of managed services, and what managed services do a managed service provider sell? And it's a big challenge for a lot of companies to figure that out and be able to articulate that. The smaller the company it is, the more critical it is that you're crystal clear on that, because you're not going to win just because. Whereas a much larger, like a Fortune 1000, a publicly traded REIT, real estate investment trust, the data center operator, can have a little bit more of an independent attitude of saying, look, this is, we're who we are. We have the premier locations and all the premier markets, partner with us or don't partner with us. We don't care, but we're going to do this, and you can decide whether you want to partner with us. So at any rate, so we have these data center managed service providers, MSPs, and they want to run Google Ads. The key for Google Ads is recognizing what Google Ads can and cannot do for your company. The one great part with Google Ads is once you really understand your buyer personas and you know the words that they're putting into a Google search box, you can make sure that as long as you're providing a relevant ad and a relevant website experience, landing page experience, and you're willing to pay enough at the intersection of all those factors, because we know the better relevance you have, the lower you're going to pay over time, as long as you do great tests with click-through rate and relevancy and quality score and all that stuff. You'll ensure that you show up on those words in a particular geographic market. So if you've determined that it's incredibly important for you to show up on like Dallas colocation or London colocation or Munich, Germany carrier neutral data center, or Singapore colocation or something like that, you can make sure that you're showing up in those searches as long as you're willing to pay enough and have a good enough website experience for a particular geographic market. That's the beauty of search engine marketing of Google Ads compared to traditional SEO. With SEO, you have no idea when you rank well on a particular page where the visitors are coming from. With Google Ads, with the exception of like virtual private networking, most of the time you know where they're going to be located. What you do not, however, know with Google Ads is you don't know how big or small their company is. And in many cases, that can be a massive potential issue and a massive potential loss factor that comes up when it comes to your budget that goes into Google Ads. In other words, like you've determined that you want to sell co-location to companies that have a certain number of employees, that are in a certain geographic region, that are in certain kinds of industries. And that particular targeting is something that LinkedIn Ads does really well, but you can't really get that granular with that kind of targeting with Google Ads. You can get really granular on the geographic, but things like company size and industry become a lot more elusive. There's ways to kind of infer into that, but it's definitely not as crisp as it should be. So one, keep that in mind, is you're not going to have an idea on the kind of company they work at or even the company size. Second, this is something I've been talking about for the better part of 10 years that we'll just put out there. Friends don't let friends do pay-per-click advertising without getting the best practices right first. So what's really important with best practices? What will make you successful with your Google Ads or any kind of pay-per-click advertising versus making you less successful? In most cases, you're going to want to drive that traffic to a lead generation landing page offer. And you can experiment and decide where in the buyer's journey you want those landing pages to be. But in most cases, people tend to get impatient and they try to drive that traffic directly into a talk to sales or schedule a tour. And if that works for you, great. Maybe you have a strong enough brand in your marketplace that you can get away with having a reasonable cost per lead, cost per acquisition with driving that traffic directly into that kind of landing page. But if it's not working for you, then more than likely what you're going to want to do is get really specific about who this buyer persona is and what they care about earlier on in their journey. And instead of going in for the kill, instead of trying to get them to go right to a sales interaction, get them to go to an educational resource, an ebook, a downloadable report, a webinar, an educational experience that helps them learn more about picking the right kind of data center managed service provider. And again, the messaging that you use, the title, the bullet points, the copywriting, the headline, this should all come directly out of the buyer persona research that you do on who you're specifically targeting. But being able to capture that lead early on and being able to nurture that lead over time, build a relationship with them over time while you continue to educate and build trust, in most cases using like really good segmented personalized email marketing and really good educational events experiences, both virtual and in person, is incredibly important to be able to win. And again, if you have the brand equity of a massive data center operator, like you're running Google Ads for QTS or Flexential or Digital Realty or NTT Global Data Centers or Equinix or some other huge company like this, you may have the luxury of being able to drive this traffic directly into a bottom of the funnel, late stage landing page. For companies that don't have that kind of brand recognition in the marketplace, educate and build trust. Get in there early, get in there often, and have a way to stay with them throughout the full buyer's journey. So Get really specific about who this ideal client profile is that you want to attract to your data center managed services ads, where they're located, what their company size is, what industries they're located in, and who the most important stakeholder is that you want to build a relationship with. From there, buyer personas will dictate the messaging and the value proposition. If you want to make sure that you're getting good return on investment from this, be open to the reality that this isn't a one and done thing, that you're not just driving leads into a sales interaction. Because again, like I mentioned before, that can work if you have a huge brand already around you. But for most companies that are selling data center managed services, it's a long game. And the better job you can do at educating and building trust with those prospects throughout the full journey, the more successful you're going to be at ultimately getting good ROI from those ads. Next question up is, how do we penetrate the data center real estate, DCRE, and construction executive search market? How do we, our company's in the executive search business, and we want to get into data center real estate and data center construction. How do we do this? That is a fantastic question. And the reason it's an especially important question is executive search recruiter is a often very misunderstood business model by a lot of go-to-market professionals. We actually consider recruiting executive search in the digital infrastructure and the data center ecosystem as part of outsourced sales and marketing. And I'll tell you why. The way we segment the data center industry at DCSMI is we have operators, we have technology companies, we have facilities companies, we have construction / real estate / investment companies, and then we have outsourced sales and marketing companies. Among the outsourced sales and marketing companies are probably the more obvious ones, like marketing agencies, PR agencies, media businesses, events businesses, sales consultancies. But we also consider recruiters part of that, because recruiters are marketing and selling job opportunities for their companies, for their clients' companies that are located throughout the rest of the data center ecosystem, either working in these different job roles, either in IT roles or operations roles or facilities roles, or sometimes go-to-market related roles, financial roles. That could either be at data center operators or tech companies or facilities companies or construction, real estate, or investment companies in and around data centers and digital infrastructure. So that said, recruiter firms, executive search firms, really need to understand how much the buyer's journey has changed in recent years, because their colleagues in other parts of the outsourced sales and marketing segment within digital infrastructure have figured this out for sure. We now live in a world where it's getting increasingly difficult for a recruiter, for an executive search consultant, for an executive search expert to get anyone to take their call unless they're really, really ready for that contact. Gartner found throughout all of B2B tech, like 83% of a typical journey is over before someone is ready to have a sales related conversation. And it doesn't matter which side of recruiting you're on, whether you're trying to get to clients or whether you're trying to get to candidates. By default, most people in both of those segments aren't going to have a conversation with you in the early and middle parts of their process until there's extreme urgency and extreme pain. The problem is, if you wait to get to know someone until there's extreme pain, in most cases, it may be too late. Why? Because a lot of the brand preferences, a lot of the infinities, a lot of the education and trust now happens in the early and middle stages of the journey, but they're not willing to talk to you during the early and middle stages of the journey unless, and this is the big unless. So 10 years ago, it was very common for people to spend time with a sales professional when they're about halfway through the journey. Today, that number hovers at like 80-85%. In other words, 80-85% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, which in many cases may be evaluating fee structures and salaries, is now happening without you in the room. And the only way that you as an executive recruiter, as executive search expert, can earn your way back in the room is to, instead of being seen by your traditional job title, to instead be seen as a subject matter expert, as a trusted advisor, as a teacher, as a consultant, perhaps even as a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center real estate and data center construction. So if you have that expertise, think about how you can show up in the early and the middle stages and earn your way in a way that they actually want to spend time with you long before there's a need to find a candidate or find a job. So how do you show up in a way that exudes deep expertise about data center real estate and data center construction? If you have the expertise to do this, fantastic. If not, you're going to more than likely want to get into journalist mode, podcaster mode, interviewer mode, panelist, moderator kind of mode. So instead of you necessarily being the expert, you go and you bring the experts together. Think about if you were moderating a panel at a conference or moderating a panel at a webinar, and you were able to find individuals at companies that you've worked with in the past who actually are from data center real estate and are from data center construction. So instead of you having to be the ultimate be all end all expert, you curate these experts and you interview them. That provides a lot of value. And that's one way among many that you can earn your way in early and often. But make no mistake, your potential clients and your candidates are learning about data center real estate and learning about data center construction from others in the industry. The question is, do you want them to learn from you so that you're able to educate and build trust with them and stay with them throughout the dozens of touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision? Or do you want them to only meet you at the end? In many cases, if they're only meeting you at the end, it's not a great experience for them or for you because it's too late to build trust. The way you build trust is earning your way in early and often. So you're in on as many of those 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision. And essentially, an executive recruiter still needs an ideal client profile, and they still need buyer personas. For sure, the goals and the challenges of a hiring manager are very different than the goals and the challenges of a candidate. And depending on how varied the kinds of hiring managers that you work with, and depending on how varied those candidates are, you may need sub-personas within each of those to get hyper relevant about making sure that your messaging, your content, your resources, your events are speaking in language that actually really resonates with each of them. And it's extremely unlikely that you're going to be able to build lead generation content and events that are valuable for both kinds of stakeholders that you deal with as an executive search firm. For sure, at the intersection of real estate and construction, your hiring managers will care about different issues than your candidates, and your candidates will care about different issues than your hiring managers. It's up to you through your doing your research to figure out what is most relevant to your business model and how you want to show up. But the better job you can do at showing up as an expert and not just a headhunter, the easier it is it's going to be to build a successful business and penetrate both of those spaces, data center real estate, DCRE, and data center construction as an executive search firm. I'd also be remiss not to mention that there's a couple of experts in data center executive search who are doing a phenomenal job with this. Like, for example, Andy Davis with his Data Center Club and publishing Thought Leadership, based in the UK, but he has a lot of presence through his additional recruiters in the US. Reese Morgan has a podcast, a weekly podcast called Data Center News Asia. I recently interviewed Reese. He'll be showing up on an upcoming episode of our podcast, the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. So just to understand, there are executive search firms that have already taken multiple steps forward and are building a playbook, building a go-to-market playbook that's highly relevant to how their hiring managers and their candidates want to learn. So they have an opportunity to educate and build trust and get in there early and often. If you're thinking you're living in this metaphorical world where your hiring managers and your candidates have never figured out how to use LinkedIn or watch podcasts or attend webinars or go to review websites or download educational resources or anything like that, you may be deluding yourselves into thinking that this buyer is vastly different than they actually are. So I'd encourage you to do your homework, do the customer insight research, and make sure that you're showing up as a deep subject matter expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with real estate and construction in the data center ecosystem. And that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. By the way, if you're getting good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for an upcoming question or topic or challenge we should address in an upcoming show, by all means, feel free to leave that in the comments. So the final question for this week is, how do we improve reach for automated software that manages data center performance? How do we improve our reach for automated software that manages data center performance? So your company is principally in the business of managing and optimizing data center performance, and you're a software company. Um, I don't know whether you're providing premise-based software or cloud or SaaS or something like that, but automated software that manages data center performance. How do you improve reach? The first thing is we need to be really clear about who the perfect company is that adopts your software, that signs on, that subscribes to your software for managing their data center performance. What do we know about them at the company level? Where do they tend to be located? That's a huge issue because when it comes to software and deploying these things for data center performance, there's often a geographic component at the intersection of verticals and compliance and certifications that dictates where you can be successful. So let's first get clear at the risk of stating the obvious when it comes to a software company, an independent software vendor. Language and localization is for sure a huge issue that intersects geographically. So think about where with your current company's roadmap, your current capabilities in your roadmap, geographically, where can you market, sell, and service right now for your automation software for data center performance? In addition to geography, what's the right company size that we need to create awareness and improve our reach for? What company is big enough to afford your minimum commitments, and what company is not so large that you may be outmatched or they may likely build these capabilities internally? So what's that band of not too big, not too small? I call this Goldilocks within your ideal client profile. And this is super important because anything that you're looking to do with reach that comes to basic prospecting tools like LinkedIn will depend on a number of employees. So once we know geographically where they're located, once we know their company size, and once we have an idea of industries where we're going to do best with our automation software for data center performance, in other words, do we have compliance or certifications that gives us superpowers in certain verticals and not others? Then we need to know who the stakeholders are that we need to build relationships with each of these companies. We'll call them our buyer personas. The most important economic stakeholder we'll call our primary buyer persona. The second most important we'll call our secondary buyer persona. And then we need to know, in their own words, the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges that we help each of these stakeholders achieve when it comes to software automation that helps them optimize their data center performance. Once we know that, we'll be in a great position to create highly relevant educational resources and host some amazingly helpful educational events, potentially both in person and virtually, on demand and live, whole host of experiences that will largely be shaped by what you find out by doing that customer insight research. So we can declare strong topical expertise for our company and our client-facing team members at the intersection of being a software company that helps with data center performance management, that helps with optimizing data center performance. And the better job we can do at that, the more likely it is that we're going to show up in a way that improves our reach in the way that they actually buy today. And that's a big deal because as recently as 10 years ago, your sales team as a software vendor, your account executives, your sales development reps would typically get to spend about half of the buyer's journey with your prospects and clients. At the time, CEB, the corporate executive board, found the number was like 56%. So they were 56% of the way through the journey before they wanted to meet with you. But conversely, you still could spend 44% of the journey with them. That number now is accelerated far to the right. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of people working from home at the start of the 2020s, a lot of baby boomers retiring and more Gen Z, more millennials in decision-making roles. We're now to the point where 83% of a typical journey is over before sales contact. So like best case scenario, you're only spending 17% of the research and decision-making process with your prospects and clients now. That's a big problem. That's a big challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity if you, your company, your team members, the clients facing team members are able to show up early and often in a way that they actually want you to show up. Not as a vendor, but instead as an expert, as a consultant, as a teacher, as a trusted advisor. And in order to nail that value proposition, in order to nail relevance, so they actually want to spend time with members of your team, we need to get super specific about who they are, what they care about, and how we can add value long before they're ready to become a sales opportunity on your deals board. Because if we wait till that happens, if we wait till they're at the opportunity stage and they've never heard of your company before, it's more than likely too late. because someone or someone's was in there early and often in the early and the middle stages of the journey and the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey, doing all of that education and trust building. So the better job that you can do as the be all end all experts at the intersection of being a software company in a certain geographic region for companies of a certain size and certain business models at the intersection of optimizing data center performance, the easier time you're going to have with not only improving reach, but improving your lead generation, the quality of your leads, the efficiency of your sales cycle, the onboarding, the monetization, and all of the unit economics that get your CFO and your board members excited about investing aggressively in this kind of initiative. So that's my advice. That's my insights on how to improve reach for an automation software company that manages data center performance. That's the final question that we're going to be addressing for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. If you want to make sure that you stay up to date on all of our new educational resources and educational events just like this, make sure that you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Until next time, I wish you great success on elevating your impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact in the growth of data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Take care now and have a great week. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.